Yep, it's there.
So are you going to put that out now?
It's coming out.
Yeah. Oh, you have the water going. Okay. Oh, geez. That's because we're sadly a little used to it. Steve. Oh. Do you want me to stand there and do it, and you turn it? Let's not do that again. I don't want to do that again.
My name is Dr. Zachariah Hildenbrand. I'm with Inform Environmental LLC and also the Collaborative Laboratories for Environmental Analysis and Remediation at the University of Texas at Arlington. We're here in Parker County, Texas at the home of Mr. Steve Lipsky. We've been out here testing for more than 3 years looking at groundwater quality, and today we're just taking some basic measurements looking at hydrocarbons in the air. Previously, our team at UT Arlington, we've detected BTEX compounds, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene. We've detected cyclohexane. We've detected chlorinated compounds, dichloromethane, chloroform. We've detected these exogenous, which means they should not be in the water, constituents in Mr. Lipsky's water. We're here today at one of his older well, and we're doing some ambient air testing. We're testing specifically for methane concentrations in the ambient air. We've used a number of different technologies. The one we have here, basically what we have is his well set up. He has the water well, and he's actually got an opening, a gas vent. But he's also got the water being pushed into basically this makeshift container. And this is to emulate the concentration of gas that you would be experiencing in a shower. We're using the Miran Sapphire spectrophotometer, basically able to detect and quantify a number of different hydrocarbons and volatile organic carbon species. This is the very same technology that was used previously by the industry, by Range Resources in their testing in 2011, in which they found no methane coming off of the gas vent, no ethane, and very small trace amounts, 2 to 4 parts per million propane. So we're collecting a measurement in this chamber, and again, coming out of the gas vent, which is basically separating the gas from the gentleman's water, we had 157,000 parts per million, and that's exactly what we have here in the chamber. We have 157,000 parts per million in this chamber. So basically, the water, as you can see, the water is coming off into this chamber, and the gas basically cannot separate before it hits this chamber. I mean, there's just so much in there that we're getting very consistent readings, either from his gas vent or from the water contained in this chamber. It's safe to say that this water, for inhalation risk, is incredibly dangerous, because methane at a high enough concentration can displace oxygen in the blood, and basically one can become asphyxiated. So that's where we're using this makeshift containment unit to emulate a shower, because if one were to bathe and shower in this using hot water, which will further volatilize the hydrocarbon gases from the water, they would be exposed to such a high concentration of methane and propane that it could be dangerous. They could pass out, and it could get to the point where they displace so much oxygen that, you know, there is basically cellular suffocation leading to fatality. Now, in terms of propane, the previous measurements were from the water discharge, which is basically coming out here. We had a measurement of 7 parts per million. So in this emulated shower configuration, we have 824 parts per million. So it's important to note that in this shower there is a certain degree of concentration happening because you're in a contained system as opposed to an exposed system. However, we're talking about a 100-fold increase from previous measurements. And again, these measurements on the property detected propane but no ethane and no methane. So in natural gas, the major constituent is methane, and the second constituent is ethane. Propane is the third largest constituent of natural gas. So the fact that they detected propane and not ethane or methane is highly alarming and quite literally makes no sense. You would only get a propane value and no ethane and methane if you were sampling from let's say a propane or propane accessory store, a barbecue store where there are propane tanks specifically. There is no propane tank here. There is a water well with a gas vent that has a tremendous amount of gas, which has methane, propane, and ethane. So we're just trying to collect measurements to determine if the water quality has changed over time, what is the viability of these previous measurements. What we do know is that we have collected dissolved gas data from the water previously in 2011, showing methane, propane, and ethane in large amounts, mainly methane, which is at concentrations between 50 and 70. Now, compared to now in 2015, we see that those measurements have been very consistent over time. So that leads us to believe that these air quality measurements have been very consistent over time. However, they were just performed improperly. From what I can see here, when we have results previously showing no methane coming from the gas vent, and now we have 155,000. Again, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to describe that because there's just so much. Whenever there is that much discrepancy, and we know based on other measurements that there hasn't been significant change, you have to question those initial measurements without a doubt. Well, we're making a second measurement. The first one was from the makeshift containment unit to emulate a shower. Okay. And here you've got the detector measuring the methane concentration directly from the gas vent on the water well. And in this case, there's so much gas here that even the vent doesn't get rid of it. So we've got 150,000 parts per million methane coming from the gas vent, and yet we've measured up to 66 parts per million gas still in the water. There's just so much, it can't come out of the water fast enough. So this currently is 3 times the lower limit for explosion. So this is dangerous stuff. So this is coming from his gas vent, and you have a value of 155,000 parts per million. So this is good news in the sense that the measurements are highly consistent. However, this is horrible news because this is 3 times the lower explosion limit for methane in air. So you not only have this greenhouse gas being emitted into the air and contributing to air quality pollution, but for anyone that is working on this well, for anyone that has to deal with water and air quality from this well, I mean, this has tremendous human health implications. We've got the Mirin Sapphire, which basically can detect and quantify gases and volatile organic carbons as a result of spectrophotometry. This is the same equipment that was used in the historical measurements that I referenced to in 2011. Again, on this vent, we have a measurement no greater than 19 was ever recorded. 19 parts per million propane was ever recorded on this property. And what we have here is, I'm just waiting for it to stabilize. We have 31,000 parts per million. So again, we go from a measurement of never higher than 19 to 31,000 parts per million. Tremendous amount of discrepancy, but as I described previously, there is a tremendous amount of concern with the previous measurements, including, the viability of those measurements, because why would you have detected propane and not detected the other hydrocarbons, ethane and methane? So at this point, we can only take those measurements with a grain of salt. What we see in this water here is consistent of thermogenic methane produced from either intermediate gas layers or shale layers. And then when you look at the compositional analysis and the isotopic analysis further, we've actually determined, and the Environmental Protection Agency has done this work, to identify that the gas in this gentleman's water well and emitting from his gas vent is the same gas as what is coming out of, or is being extracted from the nearby gas wells. When you couple that with the fact that there are constituents in here that are used in the well stimulation process and the drilling process, when those constituents are venting from his well and found in his water, it's very compelling evidence that there is an abnormality here and that the source of this is the nearby gas well in question. So we're here at the wellhead, and I've got this piece of equipment here, the Boscombe Turner, which was recommended by the folks at Miram who made the Sapphire spectrophotometer, in which their equipment is great at detecting and quantifying various species, propane, ethane, benzene, xylene. However, they have an upper limit above which it is not, you can't take viable measurements. So with that equipment, we've actually reached that upper threshold, and so we need something that is a little bit more robust. So what this piece of equipment is doing is we're measuring parts per million gas, and then we can actually get into percentage, the composition of air that is either oxygen or gas. So this is not going to be specific between methane, propane, ethane. This is going to be total gas. So I'm about a foot above the opening to the gas vent, and again, I really should be collecting these measurements with a gas mask, because we do have a lot of these VOCs that are carcinogenic. So as I tilt it down, when we're switching to gas mode, because there's just so much gas here. Okay, we're at 6% gas, 7% gas. So that's 70,000 parts per million. Now we're going to go down into the wellhead here, into the gas vent. Okay, we're at 89% gas. So this equates to, and it says low oxygen because there's just so much gas. This equates to 870,000 parts per million gas. 860,000 parts per million gas. So what this means is, what we're seeing here is combined methane, ethane, propane, these other gas hydrocarbons are upwards, up of 800,000 parts per million. And the previous measurements in this region never got above 2 or 3 parts per million. Which again are very curious results. They don't make any sense. It's quite clear that just standing here, we're above the lower explosion limit. That's dangerous. But then we also know that there are VOCs that are carcinogenic, benzene, which can lead to blood abnormalities, blood cancers, cyclohexane, which can lead to a number of different cancers. We know that these are being emitted from the air. We know that these are in his water. This is incredibly compelling evidence that something horribly wrong has happened here. Whenever you detect these compounds in the water, and you detect all 4 of those, again, that's benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, it's I would say, fairly conclusive evidence that there's been a contamination with diesel fuel. Diesel, we sometimes find benzene in the water, but we never find it with the other constituents. However, in Mr. Lipsky's well, we found all 4 simultaneously, and I believe it would be cause for concern that there has been diesel fuel used in the stimulation process of the nearby well that we believe has contaminated the water. The isotopic analysis is much like a DNA or a signature, a fingerprint, if you will, of the Barnett shale gas matches the gas that is actually coming from Mr. Lipsky's well and that is in Mr. Lipsky's water. So that is conclusive evidence that you've got some degree of contamination coming from the Barnett shale. We're here at the home of Mr. Stephen Lipsky in Parker County, an area that we've been analyzing for the last couple years. One of the most clear-cut cases of oil and gas contamination of groundwater that we've ever seen. And we're here to show an illustration of what groundwater that has been afflicted with dissolved gases, mainly methane, propane, and ethane, what that looks like when it comes out of the tap. So, I'm pouring the water here, and as you can see, it looks kind of cloudy. It kind of looks like milky water. And then as you'll see, as these dissolved gases are volatilizing and coming out of solution, you know, they're coming up into the air, it clarifies right away. So at this level, this would be considered effervescent water, similar to when you have club soda or champagne. And that normally happens at a concentration anything above 30 parts per million. With Mr. Lipsky's water, we've seen concentrations as high as 67 parts per million. And also at this concentration, the water is flammable. So again, you can clearly see how it goes from milky to cloudy, then to clear. And that's because of the dissolved gases coming out of solution. Now we have switched the water on to the municipal source. So this is basically to illustrate that those gases were, and that effervescence was a result of hydrocarbon gases, methane, propane, and ethane, and not the result of oxygen gas. So here we go. This is city water, and it goes from clear to clear. There's absolutely no change in the appearance of this water. In contrast to the well water, where it went from milky to cloudy, bubbly, and then it would clarify from the bottom as the gases are coming out of solution. One more time. Again, there is no evidence of any effervescence. It just goes clear, starts clear and ends clear. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been collecting some quantitative measurements and also some qualitative observations of Mr. Lipsky's well here in Parker County. This has been a heavily studied site in the last 5 years. Partially, well, primarily because his water quality in question has been compromised as a result of nearby drilling. So if we're to look at some of the historical measurements that have taken place here and relate those back to the measurements that have been taken more recently, there's a number of observations and particular points that need to be made here. So previously we've shown that the water coming from Mr. Lipsky's water well, which is being shuttled into this cabin here, is effervescent. That is symbolic of water containing large amounts of dissolved gases. In Mr. Lipsky's case, it's methane, propane, ethane, and he also has a number of other hydrocarbons, octane, pentane. And so if we go back to historical measurements, that observation of effervescence has been made previously. We have a report here of some historical measurements, this one being done by the Texas Railroad Commission, where it is noted that the water does effervesce. According to Isotech Laboratories, which is more or less the gold standard in dissolved gas analysis, they have referenced that anything above 28 milligrams per liter, parts per million, is the point of effervescence. And that's also the threshold at which the Department of the Interior deems water to be unsafe. When your water is above 28 parts per million, that's when there's an explosion hazard. So it is noted in the historical reports here that the water is effervescent. Yet when we get into some of the numbers, there's rather curious results. And so again, if we have effervescence, we're likely to have a methane concentration or dissolved gases above 28 parts per million. When we get into the actual reports themselves, here measurements collected in September of 2013, we have a methane value of 8.6. We have a propane value of 1.28, and we have an ethane value of 1.86. So these are certainly not indicative of water that would be effervescent. So the first thing that one needs to consider is the sampling method. There are a number of sampling methods done, one which is the RSK method. The RSK method is not a closed loop system, it's actually an open system, but when you're dealing with methane, propane, and ethane in particular, you have to be working in a closed system so that these gases cannot be relinquished up into the atmosphere and that you're actually getting a true method. Ideally, what you'd want to be doing is going down into the wellhead and collecting measurements down where the well is pulling water from the aquifer. However, the best that we can do with the equipment that we have is at the surface, but we always use a closed loop system. So to use an open loop system in this RSK method and to get the value of 8.6 yet still report that there is water effervescence, I don't feel that there is significant confidence in these values. There has also been measurements collected in a somewhat closed loop system, and it's actually an antiquated technique that Isotech had used, in which we actually have isotope data from those measurements, those collected again from the Texas Railroad Commission. However, with those measurements there are no concentrations with those values. And so we don't really know, first off, what the concentration they received from those measurements, and secondarily, we can't really assess the viability of that sample collection and those measurements because we really have no reference of the concentration. But one thing that we can say is compared to this RSK data where they're showing 8.6, and again, they're making the same qualitative observation that the water does effervesce and is foaming. But we've collected with a much more established method. It's called the Isotech flask, in which we've collected a number of measurements over the last couple of years showing readings anywhere from the mid to low 50s all the way up to the mid to high 70s of parts per million. So this is in stark contrast to the measurements of 8.6 and another measurement here of 2.8. Reported by the Texas Railroad Commission. So there is a tremendous amount of discrepancy there. We've also collected measurements at the University of Texas at Arlington through a closed loop system which involves needle and serum vials going through a rubber septum, totally a closed loop system. And we're using a new technology called VUV, and it's a new form of chromatography. And we've never seen a value less than 50 with these measurements, and we're able to actually characterize methane, propane, ethane, and even differentiate all the other hydrocarbons. And we've never seen a methane concentration with all the samples that we've collected over the last couple of years south of 50. So a number of issues. Again, the consistency in these reports and with our reporting is, yes, we have the same qualitative observations. The water effervescence. It looks like club soda. I'm sure they've still made the observation that the water smells horrible, has somewhat of a petrochemical smell. It's not your typical rotten egg smell that would be characteristic of sulfur-bearing compounds. This is more of a petrochemical smell. We've all made the same qualitative observations. Now, in terms of quantitative, there's been a tremendous amount of variance in the measurements and the methods through which they've measured the gases and the volatile organic carbons in this gentleman's water well. But what we can say is that those methods really aren't appropriate for this sample analysis. If we were to sample for minerals, water quality anions, chlorides, bromides, sulfates, nitrates, or metals, beryllium, arsenic, iron, the list goes on, then an open loop system would be appropriate for that, because those metals, those anions, are not going to volatilize from the sample. And even with volatile organic carbons, we can collect them in an open loop system, but we have to collect them with no headspace to ensure that those compounds are not volatilized immediately. But with gases, it's totally different. You have to be operating in a closed loop system, either through a hose-like system that we've used previously, or through the use of the Isotech flask. A number of institutions have used the Isotech flask here, whether it's Duke University, it's the University of Texas at Austin and their Bureau of Economic Geology, Stanford University, or us at the University of Texas at Arlington. We've all collected the same measurements and gotten very consistent results with the Isotech flask, all above 50 parts per million. So again, it's important to look at all of the historical data out there and look at how it relates to some of the measurements that are being collected by the academic institutions now with the gold standard methods. And there's tremendous amount of variability, so it does require a certain degree of critical thinking on this matter. But to be honest with you, the results are so strikingly different. And we know that the water quality has not changed that drastically over time. It makes you wonder about the quality of the measurements that were collected.
Tightness. Yeah. Oh, it helps a little bit. Okay, hold on.